All right, so I just kind of wanted to briefly introduce myself, and I think our presentation leaders will also be doing that as well, just briefly. So my name is Tessa Ray Nelson, and my practicum is currently as a rehabilitation worker in the school. So I help children rehabilitate themselves in society.
My
My
name is,
name oh, you got it, Daisy. You got it. Okay.
well, I'm Daisy. Yeah, and I'm doing my practicum at Missoula Interfaith Collaborative, working to help people that have barriers getting housing and employment.
My name is Brad Herman. I'm in a crisis screening department in a hospital in Cape May County, New Jersey. So I'm learning crisis screening from the ground up right now for my practicum.
Wow, impressive.
All right, and we will just go ahead and let Brad start.
Oh, should I read the title first? Yeah, let's read the title first. So local community organizing and change altering policy in the housing and community development system in Kansas City. I have never been to Kansas City. I hear it's lovely. And that might be in part to what this group of people did. So the CCO is the Communities Creating Opportunity. It's a group in Kansas City that regularly fights for housing rights and community change for local citizens. They fight for the production of affordable housing in the area. Their most notable contribution has been the dismantling and rebuilding of the local government that previously ran the housing administration. The meeting was convened by the CCO. It was not put up by the Housing Authority. They did a lot of community organizing to get this meeting together. The CCO is made up of families from over 20 faith-based institutions where 450 residents gathered to address the city's housing and community development issues. So this is the next slide. That meeting took place in June of 2004. The residents of Kansas City, Missouri met together to discuss housing issues. This meeting was not held right by the city. It was held by the actual organization because they wanted to address the difficulties in their housing concerns. So they highlighted many concerns, which we're going to get to in a second. We will get, the city manager, Wayne Cawthon, who's not named there, acknowledged the need for the department to be more publicly responsive. So the concerns, right? Sorry, that's what making you flip back and forth here. The concerns are vacant lots, absentee landlords, uncatered land lots. I don't know if anybody's dealt with landlords historically. They're not easy to deal with in any area, especially in the area that picture's from, which is New Brunswick, New Jersey. And I've actually been to a couple of the places that Tessa had randomly picked out. So the goals of the meeting were to get accountable city government because there was none, repair of existing homes like the ones in the picture, holding landlords accountable. I know there's some choice words for some landlords, protection from predatory mortgage lenders, and focusing on building communities. Okay, so my first question to everybody is, do we know what an infill house is? This was a term I was not familiar with, but I knew what the concept was.
I don't think I'm familiar.
So if you look at this picture on the left of the screen there is an abandoned lot, essentially, between two buildings that look like they're occupied still. What an infill home is, the bottom picture, is a very nice home goes into that vacant lot that may not match the surroundings.
So gentrification.
It does play a role in gentrification, but it is not exactly the whole piece there, because sometimes infill houses are needed and they are useful in a sense, but it does contribute to gentrification for a couple reasons. So infill housing was a discussion that was a particular concern to the CCO in Kansas City. These homes remained unoccupied due to being built next to abandoned structures or outdated infrastructure. Now, if you see a house that's beautiful like the one below it, and you see the houses that were in the picture prior, it might be difficult to move in there, right? It might not fit in a way. So the CCO wanted to focus on building and maintaining infrastructure to welcome updated residency. So fixing up the old and not just putting in new. Infill housing is new residential units in urban spaces. Gentrification involves affluent residents displacing lower income ones. Infill housing can contribute to or mitigate gentrification depending on its focus. And most of the time we see when the focus is not with the community's mindset. Yep. Okay. So the pros of infill housing, because there are some, there's more cons in my opinion. Encourages accountable city government. Where are you going to put these infill houses and how are they going to be used and utilized and paid for and bought? Potential for revitalizing neighborhoods, right? You start putting in new things, people are going to come in from out of town. It might bring in money, much like Williamsburg and Brooklyn. Can address housing shortages, right? You put new things up, people can move in, gives a need. Opportunity for community-focused development. Some of the cons. Incomplete solutions without comprehensive community planning, right? You can't just throw these things in without any plan, because then they're just going to sit there. And if they're not priced right, they're not going to move. Unoccupied infill homes in areas with abandoned houses and outdated infrastructure, right? You begin to make a community that doesn't blend. You have sections of it that are for certain people and sections of it that are for other people. Insufficient focus on home repair programs, which is going to be talked about a little later. A lack of protection from predatory lenders and absentee landlords, right? Who's owning these homes? Who's paying for them to be built? And where are they really going? Okay. So some group questions here. All right, so a little discussion question. How can we ensure that infill housing projects align with the broader needs and goals of the community? Now, this is a question that the CCO basically answered effectively in Kansas City, but I'm curious as to how we would answer it. Maybe if you put into frame your communities. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say holding focus groups with the communities. Get their direct feedback first. See what their needs are and what they'd like to have in their community, because I see this going really wrong in traditional communities where they've traditionally held a certain ethnicity or style of living, and then new homes get built. It brings in new people from outside areas who are going to bring in outside values and priorities, and it can completely change the character of a community.
I also think that that we have to like consider that sometimes if you build like a really fancy building in a community that is generally a lower income community, it can raise property taxes a lot of the time, which can put people further in poverty and can maybe impoverish the area even more so. So like not having a focus on repair or like fixing things up and that kind of a thing just kind of forces people into homelessness a lot of the times. And I can see how people would get really mad about that because I'd be pissed.
Yeah. Especially if you lived in a place your entire life and this begins to happen in that community and you weren't a part of the decision making, you're going to become a disgruntled member of the community, which is not ideal for the people who live there full time, right?
No, right.
This is something that, like, I went to Temple University, which is in Philadelphia. Temple's been there longer than some of the other houses that have been around. It was a night school to start, and I lived in a newer building that was purchased and made by a special interest group for college students, but it's in North Philadelphia. The community had no say, essentially. And as a student that goes there in the outside of the grounds, like off campus, and you're intermingled with the actual community, you see how this becomes a problem almost immediately. And if it's not discussed in a way where everybody has a say, or at least an input, bad things actually occur. Students are hurt, people are displaced, and it doesn't gel well with the actual community. And then there's this history of things going awry because nobody had a say, or the right people didn't have a say, or not everybody had a say. Does anybody else have any answer to that?
No, I feel like it was kind of really thorough in that sense. My thought is just if you don't involve the community members, that yeah, things can go haywire. So I just keep thinking of that.
Yeah. Okay, so
I
the
think
second
about
question,
like
yeah, my bad.
uh, just like how the community in a whole would benefit from the infill housing. Like, is it going to be affordable? And like you said, how is it going to affect the like the neighborhoods and stuff around it?
Yeah, I know that our tendency, right, is to think of infill housing as not going to help the community, but in some sense, building new homes, it can help. But if it's not offered in a way that already knows that it's going to be needed, it becomes that
Affordable.
gentrification piece. Yeah.
I
Okay, so
think
the second question here is,
Oh,
yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, 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 no,
I was-
no, no. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think, um, looking at Missoula's 10-year plan to end homelessness in the Missoula Valley, what they've tried to do is negotiate for affordable housing units to be built with each project, regardless of the design of the project or the intent of the project, like the new Triangle area high-rise condos that are going to be built. They're trying to secure tax grants for the developer to ensure that 20% of the housing units are going to be affordable and income managed. And so requiring that small percentage of affordable housing in each new building project can be a way that a city can ensure that infill serves the purpose of the community, not just
Mhm.
the new money that they're trying to attract to revitalize the downtown.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that concept, I've definitely heard of that concept before. And I'm glad that that's being implemented there because that does help. Okay, so the second question here. Thank you for your input, everybody. Is there a way to address the concerns of unoccupied infill homes while and simultaneously balancing the construction of new infill homes with home repair programs already existing in the neighborhood? I know that's kind of a complicated question, but how do you balance construction of new infill homes while fixing up old homes? Because that's something that needs to be combined in a sense if you want to have a full community. How do you think you do that?
I think
I'd
you would
say-
do the same thing as the top one. Like, I mean, to the first question, I think you have to involve the community in the decision. Like, first of all, so they're not like angry about everything that happens and they have a say in it. That's all I was gonna say.
I think policies and stuff should be like implemented on that they can't just like you said, keep building without them being occupied, and like a certain percentage can only be unoccupied before new buildings get developed, etc.
So that's
Think-
an interesting way to put it. Yeah.
I
Maybe
was
just
also, oh,
maybe just picking to prioritize, building up building up the community that's there, like it almost seems like you're just trying to create a new community in a way. And it's just like, but you're not focusing on like rebuilding or anything. I think one needs to happen almost before the other, you know?
Mhm.
I think if rich developers are given tax breaks to implement certain kinds of housing, why aren't regular homeowners given tax incentives from their city, county, and state to improve their community, to improve their residents?
Yeah, I mean,
I was
wish it
also
worked like
thinking,
that.
I was also thinking, what if like, can they ensure of like using local services for all of these things too, instead of like big companies? Like reach out to like, community people that have businesses that relate to this and utilizing them as well.
Yeah, keeping it local and not falling in with special interest groups for building. Yeah. So the CCO came up with an idea of how to answer that question. So I'll let Daisy get to the next slide and share that.
Oh, I think it's my slides next. So I
Yes,
will
ma'am.
go ahead and read them. So the request and the mayor. So the CCO requested, oh, sorry, my computer is freaking out. So the CCO requested $5 million fund be given for the minor home repair in their community. So during the meeting that they introduced, that they held, that's what they requested, and that's what they wanted, like people to know, like, hey, we need this. And it would target areas where the existing housing stock was strained. And this would be a 4 million increase from the already allotted 1 million. So they didn't have enough as well. And that was a huge part of the problem. The mayor's response, because he was at this meeting that they held, responded to these concerns by explaining that new housing director would be hired in the next coming months, and she planned on creating a housing task force to tackle some of the problems that they were expressing during this giant meeting that they had. So there was a big problem with like some government power corruption here and outside interests. So the city manager reassigned staff at the community housing and development department to other areas. So basically, in a way, he was like, you guys are all fired and being moved elsewhere. Not like fired in a sense that like they lost their jobs, but they were all moved off of that department because it was being driven by outside interests and they needed to be completely rebuilt from the ground up because of power differentiations and people who were like being corrupt with money. So it was implied that Housing and Economic Development Financial Corporation, the HEDFC, had been exposed for squandering public money. They would be cut from future decision makings on the flow of public funds in general. To kind of combat this like self-interest situation that was happening in a government level. And so the previous problems with the HEDFC was the renovations of 2 houses that costed 20 times the value of the property. So they were just spending money. They were not required to report expenditures to the public on development projects. So there was a lot of like money being spent that the public wasn't allowed to be aware of how it was being spent. They deflected and avoided criticisms when they were questioned about things. And by the meeting in 2004, members of the city council knew and had known about financial irregularities and problems in that department for years and years and years. Yeah, and so that picture just kind of like describes, you know, how people like in the meeting generally felt like there's not a lot of respect, not a lot of equality or justice really happening when it comes to like money being squandered that way. So the CCO, what they did to enact change was they created the necessary pressure to create change in their local government. So essentially by having these meetings and organizing themselves, you know, because they were just citizens, you know, who organized themselves into this group, they impacted local political discourse and the distribution of resources by bringing these issues up and being really confrontational about it. And it empowered people to build relationships and operate within their own powers. And it paved the way for citizen advocacy. So they were able to advocate for themselves to pressure change, essentially, during this meeting. And so when it comes to community development in a neoliberal context, the development of communities has been influenced for some time by broader processes in the global economy. And basically policies that focus on deregulation and dismantling the welfare state. And when we talk about displacing the poor for better opportunity, we're looking at like creating equal housing opportunities in places that might be like, you know, more well-to-do neighborhoods and things like that. Like those are economic risks for companies, and so they don't do those kinds of things, even though we know it creates a better system for everybody and like equal amounts of resources and such. And this leads to conservative leaning housing policies that exclude the challenge of injustice. So they're like, no, we want to keep our traditions the same because we want to be able to make money from these wealthy communities and want to uphold that and make that money. And it does create risk to do any sort of change, but change is needed to happen to kind of grow communities and adjust to become in a more equal society. But when we look at the resistance to the neoliberal context, that's kind of what's going on and why a lot of communities don't approach it that way when it should be approached that way. So just a discussion on neoliberal housing and trying to create a more equal housing market. How does this apply to clients at your practicum?
Well, in my practicum in particular, I have a client that is paying over $1,800 a month for a motel room, which is forcing them to work 2 full-time jobs, and they pretty much exist to work just to pay the bill on their motel room, and they're fully trapped. There is no way to get out of that hotel cycle unless you have family with resources or friends with resources willing to share with you, because our community certainly doesn't have anything in place for someone who already has housing, right? But they're just trapped in this never-ending cycle like a rat in a cage on a wheel, where they're just existing to work to pay that motel bill because they're not homeless, therefore they can't get services.
Yeah, that is really gross, and I'm sorry that that is happening to your client.
So I can see how that would apply. Like, there's such a high demand of outsiders moving into Missoula right now that the cost of living has skyrocketed for housing. And it's just squeezing the hell out of people who've been here their whole lives.
Mhm.
That's like my practicum placement is mostly trying to help people find housing and jobs. And that is what we see. We see people that do have like 2 full-time jobs, and it doesn't matter how good their credit is or anything. It doesn't matter, their rental history. It just doesn't matter. Like there just isn't enough housing. So then you start looking at people who like don't have great credit, like returning citizens and whatnot, and they are like at the bottom of this huge pile of applications, and it is like almost impossible to find housing.
Mhm.
Yeah. I live in Missoula as well. And the housing here is outrageous. And I work with a lot of victims of domestic violence. In a lot of ways, they find it really hard to flee their situation because they are still so financially dependent and reliant on their significant other. So even when there is like the charge through the district court, a lot of times judges will still pull back that no contact order due to the fact that the living situation is absolutely outrageous, and there's not a whole lot of other resources. There is the YWCA and everything that they can flee to, but there's always the other things too that they take in consideration, and it just makes it really difficult. So
I'm doing my practicum at the Peace Hospice at the hospital, and it's kind of different than what all of you guys are like facing. The people that suffer the most are the people that like aren't exactly like in the poverty level, but are like in the middle and they don't qualify for Medicaid and whatnot. And they're having to pay for the expense of the hospice house on their own. So each class has their own, besides like but the median definitely suffers as well.
Absolutely.
yeah, just unique challenges depending.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Ethan, I have a very similar sort of thing here in Cape May County. It's a resort town, and Cape May County doesn't have a homeless shelter. So what the motels do in the off season is they allow housing vouchers to be for rooms at the motel. Except the issue here is now the motels control how much the room costs.
Oh no.
And it's not good at all, right?
No.
You're privatizing the vouchers in a hotel or a motel ran by somebody who's trying to make money, like it's the summer seasons. So they charge the same rates to these people who have these vouchers.
That's horrible.
The same very similar. This person that I have worked with is working to pay for the place that they are being allowed to stay in because they do not have a place to stay in. And it's infuriating because they are trapped in a sense.
Absolutely. This person works 80 hours a week of hard labor just to have a bed and a roof and a bathroom.
Yeah, no kitchen for my guy. He's got a microwave.
Same.
Yeah, it's a tragedy in that sense.
Because then you're stuck. You can't even prepare food. So then you're eating out, which is even more expensive. And that's the reality of it, is the untold cost of being poor. Everything is more expensive.
Yeah, this whole concept exacerbates income inequality to a T.
Yeah. And so, so then we're gonna quickly talk about community development challenges. Community development is challenged by a need for analysis on how the globalization process are affecting community development. And from what I heard from our discussion with you guys, it sounds like the community needs to be analyzed, you know, like the issues need to be analyzed instead of just living in like a willful ignorance, which was one of the points on the previous slide, is that developers and a lot of people who are in charge of housing, they want to just make the money, you know. But what needs to happen is maybe some regulation on like community development and how we approach it, you know, like that could be a solution. And a need to identify effective approaches for local action when seen next to the globalization process. And how do you guys think that that looks like for your practicum, you know, for your clients in your practicum that you've seen? Like, what do you think would benefit them, you know, when we're looking at things from a better neoliberal perspective instead of just like a for-profit perspective?
I think there's room for capitalism. I think try to shorten my thoughts, but I was introduced to a theory of justice by John Rawls. Has anyone else learned that theory through an ethics course in your
Sounds
undergrad?
very familiar.
Huh?
It sounds familiar. The name does.
Yeah, John Rawls, A Theory of Justice. So he created this theory that we need to have government that from shared values and principles that are selected in a blind process where we are not allowed to vote for just our own interest, right? We have to take the values and the principles given to us by the least of society, those who are the most disadvantaged and oppressed, and flip the funnel of resources. Because the way it stands right now, the 1% have everything, and then it trickles down to the rest of us, right? We'll flip that funnel and aim the majority of resources through an intersectional lens at those experiencing the most oppression and challenges in this life. And then as distribution of resources dwindles, of course, the need for those resources dwindles. That's his, and he had, right now, he says that the distribution of goods and services in our society is distributed on a 60% goes to the 1%. If I remember right, 30% goes to the middle class and like 10% goes to the poorest. If we changed that to 30, 30, and 40, the rich would still have more than everybody else, but nobody would be living in poverty. And so a total redistribution of the way we distribute goods and resources is necessary to bring equity. And his point was that by doing so, capitalism can't exist unless it benefits the least of society. Like a doctor should earn more money because they went to school for longer and they have more skills, right? And everyone benefits from a doctor, therefore their salary can be higher. But if it doesn't benefit the least of society, then that inequality can't exist.
Yeah,
That's my thought.
totally agree with that.
So just moving on kind of through that, like how do we measure and assess these community level processes? Organizations like the CCO can be difficult to assess because they are not explicitly linked to the outcome they directly or indirectly shape. These organizations and their effectiveness often have to be assessed through case studies and longitudinal studies. This approach provides a multidimensional encapsulation of community complexity. Conclusion points. Empirical studies tend to focus on intra-organizational and interpersonal dynamics of community organizing rather than examining extra-organizational impacts on systems change. The case study method provides an intensive and detailed insight into a process or outcome, allowing researchers to draw conclusions that would be difficult to obtain using a single quantitative or qualitative method. The Kansas City case study demonstrates that local community organizing can play a leading role in driving local systems change, but this success is context specific and depends on factors such as organizational capacity, adaptability, and persistence. The real success of community organizing lies not in the outcome of any particular battle on local policy or practice, but in the establishment of a powerful and respected local group advocating for community interests composed of community members themselves. Case study methodology can shed light on the elusive category of questions regarding community change processes, such as which processes are causing community level changes to occur. In this example, data supports the critical role of community organizing in altering housing and community development policies in Kansas City. I think this is when we chose to do this article, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly like where Missoula is right now. Like I want to be part of this big community movement to change things. And I know we do have a lot of it here. We have like the tenants union and stuff happening, but we have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as how this applies to different class readings, looking at one of the articles that, or one of the chapters that we read in the macro practice and social work, it was the From Learning to Action for Social Justice Frameworks. It was the longest name of all time. But anyways, the authors described the framework for community organizing as the process of community action to understand and address inequality and unequal distribution of power, which kind of goes along with what Ethan was just saying. And then another framework was engaging social work for the policy practice. It was engaging social workers in analyzing and creating policy change to give meaning to people's individual troubles. The focus is on advancing policy changes that address social ills and improve social and economic well-being. And I just took all of that to mean like, the more we know, like the more is required of us. Like after reading this and engaging with like what it looks like in my practice and in my town, it just made me feel responsible.
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it shows how. Oh, go ahead, Brad.
no, the one thing that came to mind, like right off the bat after hearing your presentation, the other team, you mentioned something about like uprooting. And the first thing that came to my mind was obviously our presentation, we're about to do it in like grassroots movement. I'm curious if like those terms are maybe similar in a sense, because it sounds like to uproot something, you become a grassroots movement just by.
I think so.
It happens. So
I think so. It means start at the bottom, start with the affected community, talk to them, see what they need, what they want, and hear their ideas and really listen to them. Not just, how many times have we heard leaders from the Black community say we need reparations to be whole? And how many people automatically discount that and just say, nope, not happening, right? That's ridiculous. But it's not really our place as white people to say that that's ridiculous, right? If we're looking at equity and justice and their full participation in society and government, then their needs and what their leaders, their community accepted and pushed up elevated leaders say is legit. And it's our job to look within ourselves at why we automatically reject that. Sit with that, think of why. Well, because of the internal white self, right? The one that is committed and invested in policing the distribution of benefits of society.
Yeah, and like you said about the John Rawls thing, right? We need that veil of ignorance to come back into play at some point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a whole huge conversation, really. Like when I was taking that wrestling with the truth, there was a lot of talk about how everybody sees injustice as like this historical thing, as if it isn't still taking place.
Right.
People are like, well, how can I take responsibility for something that happened way back here? And it's like, okay. So like it really is about like bringing the truth to light that racism is alive and well. Like, we're still living in this society of like being colonizers just by being blind. And anyways, yeah.
I also think that like in a more of like a housing applicable situation, like it really does tie together because like we're seeing these like the communities that are usually struggling with lack of economic opportunity, the housing that is falling apart, they are people, people from African American descents or people who live on reservations, that have been systematically oppressed, from lack of opportunity. And so creating housing opportunity and creating equal opportunity in housing is a huge part of, the issue. And it could also be a huge part of the solution, if we allowed ourselves to not, think outside a corporate lens, is how I would phrase that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, a good way to tie all that together is we have like a family housing center that's connected to the YWCA in our town. And the family housing center part of it is like for homeless families, like families experiencing houselessness. And they house like 31 families. But of that population, 30% are like people of color. And of that 30%, I can't remember, it's like, I'm not quoting this exactly, but we were just talking about it at work at my practicum, and it's like 45% are like indigenous people. So, or like American Indian people here. Like, so it's huge. It's a huge problem that we're aware of to a degree, but it's not being addressed fully, obviously, or it wouldn't be such an issue. Anyways. Okay, sorry. Moving on again. So our overall conclusions from this article, or of the article: after careful consideration, a case study explored the CCO's meetings and engagements with media to push for community housing change. They discovered that the CCO was able to effectively push for housing change in their communities. And this is not to say that all community organizations will have the same effectiveness, but it gives the example of steps that can be taken to encourage change on a macro level. And then we just have our references listed on the last slide. Does anybody have anything else they want to say or any questions they want to ask any of us, or just about the article in general?
No, I think you guys did a really great job of, I guess, presenting all of this information. Seems like it was quite a bit of information, but yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you
Appreciate
guys
that.
so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for participating.
It was
All right.
a good presentation. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you guys for engaging in discussions and stuff. That really adds to the overall flow. It really does. All right.
I think
Well,
it was kind of nice also to tie the two presentations together to realize that they can inform each other.
Right. Yeah.
You go from macro, or what did they call it? The case to cause, the micro to the macro.
mhm,
So
Yeah.
they kind of coincide for that theme.
mhm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording now.